Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial and welcome to our brand new theatre. My name is Dr Carl James and I'm the Head of Military History here at the Memorial. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Now this afternoon we are very excited to welcome Dr Kristen Alexander to deliver the first public history talk here in this new theatre. And we haven't had one of these, we haven't had a public history talk since at least about 2019. So it's very, very exciting for us to do this again. Now Kristen's presentation, Liberated but Never Truly Set Free, Stalag Luft III's POW's return, is part of our special program of events commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. This program will include free monthly talks, a special performance of the play 21 Hearts, Vivian Bullwinkle and the Nurses on the Viner Brook, and the special one-day symposium interpreting Australia's Second World War, previewing Anzac Hall in August. So check the website for details. Before we start, however, I'd like to please ask you to observe the following courtesies for the comfort and safety of all visitors. Please be aware that food and drink, except for water, is not permitted in the theatre or in the memorial's galleries. And please turn your mobile phones to silent. The fire exits, behind you, are located in the rear of the room. In the event of an evacuation, please follow the directions of memorial staff. The bathrooms, out and to the left, are located outside of these doors, beyond the shop and the cloakroom. And memorial staff will be happy to provide any further information and assistance if required. I would now like to introduce Dr Kristen Alexander. Kristen is an award-winning historian and author with a deep passion for Australia's aviation history. A visiting fellow from UNSW Canberra, her research is focused on the Second World War Australian Airmen, prisoners of war and their families. In 2022, she was awarded the Australian War Memorial's Bryan Gandevia Prize for Australian Military Medical History. And her works include Clive Caldwell Air Ace and Australia's View in the Battle of Britain. Her sixth book, we have right here, Kriegies, the Australian Airmen of Stalag Luft III, was awarded the Anzac Memorial Trustees Military History Prize in the 2024 New South Wales Premier History Awards. She was also a regular contributor to Wartime magazine, and I'm sure she will become a new contributor to WM, the War Memorial's new magazine, in the future. Now please welcome Dr Kristen Alexander.
Thank you, Carl, for those kind words. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples as the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have contributed and continue to contribute to the defence of country in times of peace and war. I also wish to thank the Australian War Memorial for inviting me here today to share some of the experiences of a small group of Second World War airmen who offered their service for their families and homeland. Rumours by the million, Bill Fordyce wrote as May 1945 opened. Recently evacuated from Stalag Luft III, a Luftwaffe camp located near what is now Zagan in Poland, Fordyce and his fellow POWs were eagerly awaiting liberation. After leaving Stalag Luft III, they had travelled hundreds of kilometres on foot and in cattle trucks. They were now about 7 kilometres from the front. Very heavy fire round us, Fordyce wrote. Colossal air cover, goon jets all around too. Fordyce was worried. Had he and his fellow POWs survived the war and captivity only to be killed at the last moment? Suspense terrible. Journalist Paul Brickhill, master of the colourful turn of phrase, later described the tension. You could practically see the nerves sticking out of everyone's skin and vibrating like piano wire. The next day, 2 May, God, what a day, Fordyce wrote. Hundreds of retreating goons along the road throwing equipment into lake or selling or giving it to the lads. And then, one small armoured car drove in, and we were free, just like that. Fordyce doesn't record what he did next, but Brickhill did, and we can imagine the sheer joy, the ecstasy that engulfed the men. They rushed forward, screaming at the top of their voices. All around was a whirl of activity and emotion, cheering, euphoria, relief. For one man, and perhaps all of them, that moment was the best thing that had happened since I've been in this God-forsaken country. The Australian Airmen, along with all POWs in the European theatre, had waited so long for liberation. Germany and Italy had captured over 140,000 members of British and Commonwealth forces during the Second World War, including about 8,600 Australians. Of those, almost 1,500 served in RAF and RAAF squadrons. 351 of them, down in Europe, the Mediterranean and the Western Desert, had been imprisoned in Stalag Luft III between its April 1942 opening and January 1945 evacuation. No prisoner of war liked being called an inmate of a camp, nor did they particularly like being dubbed POW, the obvious shorthand of their official status. So airmen captives came up with their own designation, Kriegie, short for Kriegsgefangene. The emphasis on the first syllable, the German word for war, Krieg, signified that they were still men of war. Stalag Luft III's Kriegies demonstrated this by their commitment to escape. The most notorious is the March 1944 mass escape, now popularly known as the Great Escape, where 50 recaptured airmen were shot by the Gestapo on Hitler's orders, including 5 Australians. 345 of Stalag Luft III's Kriegies survived captivity. Depending on which camp they were evacuated to, they were liberated during April and May 1945. They had no doubts about an eventual Allied victory, and home for Christmas was a constant refrain every year. But rather than unalloyed joy, liberation was unsettling. After the initial excitement, Fordyce and other airmen were wandering around, teeming in rain, looking dazed. It was too much to take in. I feel like crying, Fordyce admitted. No wonder. For Fordyce, Brickhill, and other Kriegies, it had been a long emotional, psychological, and physical journey from capture, interrogation, incarceration, to freedom. Today is almost, or near enough, the 80th anniversary of victory in Europe. For service personnel, VE Day signalled imminent return to homeland, family, and civilian life. But as Bill Fordyce shows us, darker emotions underpinned the thrill of victory and liberation. Later, he and others would discover that return and reintegration were not uncomplicated processes. For many, the strains, trials, and terrors of captivity reverberated throughout their lives. To commemorate this significant anniversary, I will counterpoint the elation of liberation and homecoming with one of the tragic legacies of captivity, trauma. Freedom was exhilarating, Once back in Britain, the unattached went to parties. Some had arrived in time to attend VE celebrations. Those with British sweethearts and wives had romantic reunions. Some rekindled platonic friendships. Others went crazy as they released sexual tension with willing partners. Many of the newly liberated found those first heady weeks overwhelming. I was completely unsettled and bewildered by being back in England, one ex-Kriegie wrote to his sister. Crowds and strangers made some feel nervous. Poor Brickhill could barely work up the courage to board a London train. They were experiencing culture shock. The recently released yearned for home, normality, and their loved ones. But even as they envisaged stepping onto Australian shores and into loving arms, the ex-Kriegies were anxious about what they would find. What changes had taken place after so many years away? "Let me know anything you can about conditions at home," one entreated as he awaited his berth on a repatriation trip. Before claiming those berths, the ex-Kriegies had to be medically cleared. Desperate to return to civilian living and forget the lesser moments of prison life, as one man explained it, they assured medical officers that they had recovered from the hardships of captivity. One who repeatedly wrote of his unsettled state while in Britain and recalled feeling desperately tired and jittery during that period gave no hint of it in his medical examination. He hid his state so well that his new bride had no idea, nor did he. He was so relieved to be out of the war that, he admitted later, he was on a high and truly believed himself to be well. And so he convinced the medicos. Others more actively conned them. The end result was that many Kriegies who were not fully fit were repatriated back to Australia. Almost 700 RAAF ex-prisoners of war, including former Stalag Luft III Kriegies, embarked on the SS Orion in August 1945. Others would follow. As excited as they were, there was an undercurrent of trepidation as the Australian shoreline hove into sight. Home to a country which many left 4 or 5 years ago. There will be changes, a columnist for the Shipboard Journal wrote. I wonder how we'll react to them. The ex-Kriegies were greeted with street parades and public welcomes. I've been researching the Australian Airmen of Stalag Luft III for over a decade, and here is my all-time favourite photograph, taken at the huge Melbourne cricket ground reception. The young woman, Evelyn, told me that she just rushed to where she thought her sweetheart would be. I was running up this incline. I just ran. I just didn't care about anybody, anything, whether it was protocol or we had to form a queue. I thought, darn this, I've waited 3 years. Somehow, she found Eric and flung herself into his embrace. Tears, laughter, you can see it yourself. It seems they would never let each other go. A photographer caught the moment. The joy of reunion is well expressed in this human study, the caption reads. But as at liberation, their euphoria was tempered. Eric suffered nightmares. He took a long time to settle, and he kept silent about his experiences because he didn't want to visit his trauma on Evelyn. My emotions were turbulent, overwhelming joy, disbelief, uncertainty, another man remembered. Some found the admixture of so many conflicting feelings difficult to handle. Some were disconcerted by the throngs of noisy, jubilant people when they wanted quiet, understated reunions where they could better get their bearings. We came home excited to be home, one man recalled. But war had transformed the home front, individual hometowns, and everyone and everything the ex-Kriegies had known and cared about. Recognising how much life had altered, Melbourne's Argus newspaper published a digest of happenings. The little booklet did much to inform repatriates of recent events: Melbourne Cup winners, sporting results, the political situation, death of notabilities, the latest slang. It could not, however, prepare them for the emotional impact of changes on their intimate home front. Brothers and friends had been killed in battle. Loved ones had aged or changed. Younger siblings have grown up. Some barely recognise them. Elderly relatives, even parents, had died. One man found that whilst everything was still the same, somehow everything was different. Another felt that we were strangers at home. Both Britain and Australia had welcomed medical repatriates from POW camps during the course of the war. Authorities and medicos, accordingly, already had a sense of the psychological strains of captivity. They were also able to draw on the experiences of Great War returnees, many of whom had suffered what was termed, at the time, barbed wire disease. While journalists speculated as to whether repatriates will be warped, normal, or strange, medical officers anticipated some internment effect or adjustment disorder, a continuing intrusion of unsettling emotional and psychological disturbances. This, they acknowledged, would arise from the exceptional abnormal conditions of captivity. The quickest way to get over those psychological and emotional effects, the RAAF believed, was a few weeks in a medical rehabilitation unit, more leave than demobilisation. The ex-Kriegies and all former POWs and service personnel for that matter were then expected to immediately move on. We are all glad to know you are among us again, and I hope the past will soon be forgotten and you will be able to laugh it all away, one man's sister wrote. The road back to civil life was paved by similar sentiments from family and community. Travellers were aided by the Ministry of Post-War Reconstruction, which produced a useful handbook covering entitlements and government aid schemes. But re-establishment proved difficult for some. The societal expectation was for ex-servicemen to become husbands, fathers, and providers. Marriage and fatherhood was no problem. Almost 80% of ex-Kriegies were unmarried at capture. For those bachelors, there was a sense that there was still no time to lose, and the marital status of most of them soon changed. At least 20 married before embarkation or became engaged to British women who would follow them back to Australia in bride ships. At least 40% of Australia's almost 40% of Stalag Luft III's Australian bachelors, including our joyous couple, tied the knot before the end of 1946. Almost 2/3 of those who had been single by liberation were married by 1950. Many of those contributed to Australia's post-war baby boom. Providing, however, was a different matter. While some were able to go back to their pre-war jobs or had studied in captivity to prepare themselves for good post-war positions, others had nothing to go back to, or they felt they were overqualified, or they simply had no idea what they would do. "I'm not committing myself to anything," one man declared. "I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life," another later admitted. For some, the shock of adjusting to changes on the home front, settling into marital life, new jobs, or even just deciding what to do was challenging. Life had changed so much. And so had they. When I first met my husband prior to his going overseas with the RAAF, he was a gay and charming extrovert, one wife wrote. When he returned home after some years in a German POW camp, although on the surface the same person, I found after our marriage he was very changed. Her husband continued to suffer psychologically from his captivity experiences. So too did many others. They tried to forget, to not talk about life behind barbed wire, except in anecdote, the humorous stories. But the memory of captivity, the negative emotions it evoked, the traumatic residue, leached into many lives. Starvation rations, overcrowding, captive violence, grief over the murders of comrades by guards or in the Great Escape reprisals, the forced marches, the dread that they would never return home, the guilt that they had survived. And we can't forget the consequences of their commitment to escape. Claustrophobia. Paul Brickhill, for example, was crippled by it. Tunnel collapses, fear of discovery and its consequences, and lonely weeks in the cooler. Some suffered more than just an adjustment disorder. Within 12 months of return, many were diagnosed with, to use the terminology of the day, nervous disorders and anxiety states. One ex-Kriegie was feeling irritable and nervous and had begun to experience panic attacks. In early 1946, he began to think that something was wrong with him. He could get to sleep, but would wake up petrified with a dreadful start and suffer a generalized panic. He endured both nightmares and flashbacks and was terribly edgy the whole time. His traumatic memories encompassed service and captivity experiences. His mind would fly to being in the tunnel, or being shot down, or revolting against the filth of the PW camp, or the close shaves, or finally being shot down. His emotional anguish so soon after homecoming was palpable. Repetition emphasised distress. So too did his mixed chronology. Bill Fordyce was another who suffered nightmares in those early years. He had been caught in the tunnel when the Great Escape was discovered and used to dream about it on the anniversary. His nightmares eventually faded, but a sense that something was not right lingered. I think it took a long time to feel normal. But while he felt normal, he knew he wasn't. Paul Brickhill's life history and medical records suggest that he never felt normal, never recovered from captivity trauma. These examples were not atypical. Medical case files compiled by the Repatriation Department, later renamed the Department of Veterans Affairs, reveal that such symptomatology falls within the diagnostic criteria for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition which could manifest when a person experienced a stressful event that would evoke significant symptoms of distress in almost anyone. PTSD is difficult to diagnose, and it can't be diagnosed retrospectively. So I have adopted the term captivity trauma to denote captivity-related psychological distress and the intrusive memory of it. I didn't consult all of the ex-Kriegies' medical files. Some had been destroyed. Some men or their wives were still alive. But along with health-related records from other sources, I was able to delve into the medical histories of about a third of Stalag Luft III's survivors. I found that some recovered their psychological equilibrium in a relatively short time. Their transitory states may have related to culture shock and the struggle to readapt to civilian life. But the evidence I consulted also demonstrates that many assessed fit for discharge from service were suffering serious psychological conditions within 5 years of war end. After a decade, 36 had claimed or were medically diagnosed with a medical condition including nervous breakdown, severe depression, nervous debility, and captivity-related nightmares. 29 experienced 2 or more decades of traumatic symptomatology. Some who successfully managed their trauma or had quashed it in the earlier years through self-will or culturally endorsed silence suffered from late life reactivation. Retirement, when they lost the protective benefits of work and regular social engagement, particularly proved an unhappy turning point. Storms, films, and riots also triggered post-traumatic symptoms in the ageing ex-Kriegies. Memories haunted their subconscious dream processes and daytime thinking. Those waking experiences, emotionally distressing flashbacks, left some so disoriented they could barely recognize them as traces of memory. Those recurrent intrusive recollections evoked negative emotions. They were overwhelmed by a sense of dread and anxiety. "I feel my life is ruined," one man stated in 1993. Another claimed in 1995 that he was a nervous wreck all the time. It is perhaps no coincidence that these statements fell within the Second World War's 50th anniversary period. And indeed, the Australia Remembers program proved especially triggering for some. One ex-Kriegie, hoping for catharsis in sharing his story for Australia Remembers, agreed to speak at schools, colleges, and other venues. His nostalgic recollections, however, were destructive, not healing. After some months, the old problems, including debilitating flashbacks, returned and have remained, he wrote. Some living with captivity trauma, including this man, were ultimately diagnosed with PTSD. Others, who might have been, had died before it was either recognised within the medical community or DVA. DVA medical files contain many explicit, heart-rending accounts of trauma. The ex-Kriegies' distress is obvious. Their psychological and physical pain, their battle with bureaucracy for official acknowledgement of it, makes for harrowing reading. And I'll readily admit that I was moved by their experiences. But despite such clear evidence, their captivity trauma is little known outside the Kriegies' immediate families. This is because it has been largely overshadowed by that of former prisoners of Japan. Over 22,000 Australian service personnel had been captured by the Japanese. Approximately 14,000 returned at roughly the same time as the Kriegies. The suffering of those repatriated from Japanese camps was apparent in their eyes and in their wasted frames. By contrast, Stalag Luft III survivors, numbering only a handful compared to those repatriated from Japanese camps, looked fit and well. Most had regained the weight lost in camps and during the forced marches by the time they arrived home. Throughout captivity, the Kriegies had written letters to home folks emphasising their relatively comfortable living conditions. Red Cross comforts, sporting facilities, the plays they'd put on in camp theatres. German censorship aside, they underplayed or didn't disclose the low rations, the fear that they would never see out the war, and threats to their physical safety. Their letters were full of humour. They hadn't wanted their families to worry or think that their masculinity had been compromised. They failed to enlighten them about the true state of affairs when they returned. But in painting a rose-coloured picture of life behind barbed wire, they created the myth that family and society believed that they had had a benign captivity. The disparity of evidence was reinforced after repatriation by early newspaper stories of atrocities perpetrated by the Japanese, and later reports from journalists covering war crimes trials, which revealed brutal and barbarous treatment. Even the earliest POW literature emphasised the benign, harsh binary. In 1946, Rowan Revette's Behind Barbed Wire highlighted the physical traumas of captivity, the callous inhumanity of the Japanese. In the same year, Paul Brickill and South African journalist and fellow Stalag Luft III Kriegie Conrad Norton published their Escape to Danger. And here I quote from the dust wrapper flap of my copy. "The story of the miracles that saved the lives of airmen but sent them into captivity. The story of the great tunnel escape, one of the most thrilling feats of human ingenuity." It emphasised the tragedy of the Great Escape, but it was a book of daring do. Brickill's The Great Escape and a flurry of extracts was published in Australia in 1951. Despite the ultimate murders of 50 airmen, this was another celebration of action, excitement and bravery, with few unsavoury consequences. It was counterpointed in 1952 by Russell Braddon's The Naked Island, another memoir of Japanese atrocity and POW suffering. The dichotomous perception of captivity became culturally entrenched. In 1946, a report published by the Repatriation Commission determined that many ex-POWs of Japan experienced malaise, fatigue, moodiness, and symptoms of psychological disturbance. While DVA medical records show that these states were also experienced by men imprisoned in European camps, a survey conducted in the early 1950s by the Repatriation Department excluded those who had been incarcerated in Italy and Germany. Most prisoners of war in Europe did not suffer the same hardships as those who were prisoners in Japan, stated Senator Walter Cooper, the Minister for Repatriation. Nothing in Europe appears to have approached the appalling conditions of employment in the Burma-Siam Railway. While DVA did recognise that some medical conditions related to captivity, decades passed before Stalag Luft III's ex-Kriegies and others interned in European POW camps were publicly acknowledged as victims of captivity. In 2001, former prisoners of Japan, or their widows, were granted a one-off payment of $25,000 in recognition of their traumatic experience. Similar compensation, however, was not awarded to former prisoners of Europe until 2007, and only then after considerable lobbying, with many men and wives sharing their terrible stories of trauma. But 275 of Stalag Luft III's post-war survivors never received that government and civic acknowledgement. They had already died. For many ex-Kriegies, captivity did not end at liberation or homecoming. Some of those with early expressions of disturbance recovered, some didn't. The residue of captivity clung to their bodies, minds, and hearts. Bound up with captivity trauma was compromised masculinity, relationship breakdowns, and moral troubling. Some perpetrated domestic aggression, violence, or coercive control against wives, children, or parents. A small few contemplated, attempted, or died by suicide. The traumatic legacies of captivity also percolated through the generations. As one son, reflecting on his father's post-war traumas, explained it to me, I think the words liberated but never truly free say it all. His father, the former gay and charming extrovert, was one of those who could not endure. He took his own life. But while others were never truly free of their captivity trauma, not all lives were ruined. Love, family and community support, faith, good medical care, and eventual DVA recognition of condition helped them survive, cope with, and manage the ravages of captivity trauma. But there was something else. Resilience. That capacity to bounce back and adapt was a fact of life for the ex-Kriegies generation. Many had seen the physical and mental effects of the Great War on fathers, families, and members of their community. They were children and young adults of the Great Depression. They had successfully negotiated captivity. As one consultant psychiatrist assessed, ex-Kriegies were of a particular personality type found among combatants who carried on where lesser individuals would have given in. As a group, one nonagenarian told me, we were pretty resilient. The majority of Stalag Luft III's ex-Kriegies remained as intellectually, economically, and socially active as increasing age and the legacy of physical and psychological wounds allowed. They and their wives lived happy, fulfilled, though difficult lives, including the couple in my favourite photo. Though racked with lifelong mental and bodily pain, they recognised the value of life and made a commitment to enjoying it to the fullest. As such, many of the Australian Airmen, even Bill Fordyce, who never felt that he had recovered from captivity, believed that they were one of the lucky ones. Thank you. Before Carl calls for questions, it's time for the advertisement. If you'd like to read about how the Kriegies fared behind barbed wire or about the Great Escape, signed copies of Kriegies are available in the bookshop, and I checked them beforehand. They're there. If they sell out, manager Martin will order more. And if you're keen to discover more about the lifelong legacies of captivity, you'll have to wait a couple of years as the work in progress is very much a work in progress. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, Kristen. I was going to plug your book, but you've done that very successfully already.
Please do.
But in all seriousness, though, thank you very much for kicking off our series of commemorative talks to mark the end of the Second World War. I think you'll all agree that was an incredibly powerful and moving presentation. And it's also a timely reminder that while it's appropriate for us to mark the 80th anniversary of VE Day just last week, that the war and the consequences of war continue for decades afterwards. And in many reasons too, I think looking up at Evelyn and Eric previously, you can see why so many people thought the Second World War were, the generation who fought the Second World War were the greatest generation. We have a time for questions, so if you have one, please feel free. We have two colleagues here, Dr Tom Rogers and Dr Lachlan Grant. They have microphones, so please, fire away, Kristen.
Thank you. I'll just swap glasses so I can see.
Kristen to Lachlan.
Hi, I'll ask the first question. Lachlan up here.
Hi.
I've probably got the lights right behind me. Thank you very much for coming and giving us such an excellent talk today and for your excellent book on the Allied Airmen, or the Australian Airmen at Stalag Luft III. Can you talk to us a little bit about your motivation to do your PhD on Australian Airmen POWs of the Germans? so much of the scholarship in Australia has been on Australian prisoners of war of the Japanese?
It was by accident. My second biography was of Jack Davenport, an Australian airman who served with 455 Squadron RAAF. He had a sterling aviation career, and it was because a fellow squadron member, Jimmy Katana, was captured and became a prisoner of Stalag Luft III. Jimmy was one of the Australians killed in the Great Escape reprisals. Because he left the vacancy of squadron leader, Jack Davenport was promoted and went on to bigger and better things. I didn't know terribly much about Jimmy's experiences at the time, but it did make me wonder what happened or what airmen thought when they couldn't fly, not because they died, which they had expected, or because the war ended, which again they expected, but because they had been taken out of the air war forcibly. Because of Jimmy, and also I had a long internet friendship with another former prisoner of war of Stalag Luft III, I became interested in Stalag Luft III after I finished writing my Australia's View in the Battle of Britain. And one of the Australians in the Battle of Britain was actually captured and spent some time in Stalag Luft III. So it was by accident, but there were also a number of intersecting factors. So I started researching Stalag Luft III, starting from the point of the Great Escape. And I was eventually going to write a book about it. But Lachlan asked about the step towards the PhD. And that was simply because the more I researched, the more I realised that there was more to life in Stalag Luft III than the Great Escape. There was a vast archive out there, and families were coming to me with their records. And I thought, well, I can't just concentrate on 4 men. I have to tell a broader story, but I didn't have the skills to do it. I had only written essentially biographies or collective biographies. I couldn't do what would be essentially a biography of a camp or of an experience in a camp. So I talked it over with a few friends, and before I knew it, I was enrolled in UNSW Canberra's PhD program with some brilliant supervisors, the freedom to explore to my heart's content. I was originally going to do just life in Stalag Luft III, and I hope nobody from DVA is here because this is a confession. I applied to access medical records of former prisoners of war on a fishing expedition. I thought that those records would include stories of their life in captivity. But when I read them, I realised that captivity hadn't ended for them. They had had an entire life of it, and it had affected so many people in so many terrible ways. And that's when the PhD suddenly became 2-phase. The first half was life in camp, the second half was what happened next. And that will be the subject of the work in progress, what happens next.
Any other questions or time for questions? Up the back. Tom? You one, and then there's the second one down.
Sorry, raise your hand.
Emily? Sorry.
Thanks very much, Kristen. It was so interesting.
Thank you.
Just wondering how many of these boys are left that you know of in Australia?
I don't think there are any. I had been, up to about, say, 3 years ago, I'd been tracking it with DVA, and there were about 2 names that hadn't come up, but then my contact left, and I didn't have anybody else to ask. I haven't found an obituary for the last couple. Some had moved overseas, so I had no access to that records. But I would say, given that when I did the demographic and the statistics, the majority of them were born in 1920, 1922. So if any have survived, they are extremely elderly men, and we perhaps would know about them because they would be lauded, sadly, almost as last man standing. The nonagenarian that I mentioned, he died a couple of years ago when he was 101. He was born in 1920. He was a 20-year-old when he enlisted. So I can't say conclusively, but I would say it's highly unlikely that we have any Australian survivors.
Tom, stand in front.
Dr. Alexander, thank you for what I think was a real eye-opening presentation.
Thank you.
You're quite right. We often hear stories of the prisoners of war in Europe, nothing compared to the Japanese. Those men obviously suffered very badly. My question relates to what was the process for repatriating them once the war ended? I mean, you've got men in absolutely horrific conditions. Just getting them back to Britain is going to overtax the logistic capability of the Allied armies. How quickly did they get them back to Britain, and how quickly did they get them back to Australia?
They got back to Britain relatively quickly. The Allies launched Operation Exodus, so British and American aeroplanes were ferrying them back very, very quickly after liberation. I don't know the exact dates, I'm not too good on dates, but Bill Fordyce was back in Britain within about a week after liberation. So it all happened very quickly. They went in staging posts. Some in the Far Eastern camps took a bit longer, but from between April to May, they were liberated, and before the end of May, they were all back in Britain. Getting shipping home was a different matter because there were an awful lot of priorities on it. As I mentioned, the Orion set sail in August. Some Australians had gone home earlier, some were later, but most, if they wanted to, were back in Australia before the end of the year. Some people chose to stay in Britain as long as they possibly could. Those with sweethearts or wives, those who were scoping out employment opportunities. The friend that I had mentioned that I'd been in email contact with, he went home via America, via Canada. Partly it was to study up for his future wool classing career, but also he was a friend of one of the great escapers who was killed, and he was taking personal artefacts back to his friend's family. So the Australians trailed back over a few months. In England, they took advantage of the fact that they had time. I mean, the Air Force couldn't do anything with them, basically, so they sent them on leave constantly. So they went and toured the countryside, stayed with friends, stayed with family, because as we all know, Australia had a very strong connection to Britain at the time. Some of them were sons of Britishers. So they spent time with family and friends, and they got impatient, especially ones who were married, but they got home eventually if they wanted to.
Kristen, same row. Krista, sorry.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Alexander. I just wanted to ask, do the DBA records, have they been sort of set out so that you can draw sort of broader statistics from them? Have they haven't done that at work at all? So
No. I sought access to them under their special access provisions because they weren't publicly available at the time, and I jumped through hoops. And then we had to identify them, so I produced lists of names, and partly there was ones that I knew that trauma was probably in there. and also all good stories, as in like the people that I'd found stories about. So we kind of worked our way through to get roughly 100. And as I said, I couldn't get access to them for people who were living, or if their wives were still living, or some had died so early that their files had been destroyed. I did the mortality statistics, and quite a few had already died in the 1950s, by the 1960s, so obviously they had been destroyed. DVA hasn't done any kind of analysis of them. As far as I'm aware, very few people had played in the Second World War repatriation files, and I was the first for the prisoners of Europe, and in this narrow focus. They're still not publicly available, but you don't have to go through special access. You can go through DV, just apply through National Archives to have them examined, but getting them examined is extremely difficult. I've just received a notice after waiting for 90 days that the department still hasn't examined them. So trying to extend my research, to get a bigger pool of evidence. I honestly think I've probably got enough evidence to say that yes, at least a significant number suffered, but you're curious, you want to know more, you always want a better story, or there might be something else. One of the things I'm particularly interested in was whether these men had become morally troubled in some way, and I mentioned that briefly. Some had, but because moral injury had never been heard of when these men were alive and discussing their medical problems, you can only find traces of it, so I only had a very small sample. So I want to try and get more evidence to support that. But here, I think that it's going to be an extremely long process, and I will have finished the work in progress before I get access to many more files, sadly. That's just the nature.
Last question up the back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexander. Just following on from what you're saying there, and as you say, the generation you're writing about have all died. Their children are probably alive, their grandchildren. How are you managing what, for want of a better term, could call, say, the ethical issues of writing about the trauma of these parents and grandparents, given that that generation will be reading those stories?
Most of this evidence came as part of my PhD, and I signed with family members agreements giving me permission to use the material for the PhD and future writings. If I don't have that permission, and certainly I don't have permission to use medical evidence, that's why I said someone, another man, a sister, I de-identify. But I have the family members, and I was absolutely astounded when I twigged the other week that these sons and daughters, they're now in their 70s. Some have already died. I'm also liaising with grandchildren, indicating sort of the long generational legacy. I send extracts of Kriegies to family members if I was identifying them. Some of them allowed me to quote from the DVA medical files. But it's a fine balance, and my research is continuing a long time after the PhD, and they're aware of it. But I ask, they give permission, I acknowledge. I give them, the son of the gay and charming extrovert, for instance. He's happy for me to reveal his name, his father's name, to tell his father's story, but I'm facing the ethical challenge in my continued work on domestic violence emanating from captivity trauma, in that I can't tell his mother's story. So I can't link the two. When I write about it, they're separate and appear as if it's two separate families. But, and certainly with the domestic violence issue, and there are quite a few cases of this, that is a real ethical dilemma. It's on some public record for some people. I'm extracting, because you can get divorce files, but then in other cases it's in the medical archive, and I can't reveal the name there. So how I got around it in the thesis and in Kriegies and in some of my later writing, more recent writing, I'm using nom de plumes, so that we still get the sense that these are real people, but you can't look at the nominal role and say, oh, that's that person, and breach their confidentiality. Especially when you think that with medical records, they're between themselves, they're specialists, they're practitioner or DVA. The men had no concept that the records would be repurposed, that anybody like me would come along, plunder them, pick, choose, tell this story, tell that story, interpret. So yeah, it's ethical minefields, dilemmas, and I hope that I am treading carefully.
Well, thank you, Kristen. You always tread very carefully. And thank you again for a very powerful, very moving presentation. Showed the importance of historical research in that place in terms of us understanding and figuring out the consequences of the war. It's one thing to think about what these men and women did during service, but their post-service journeys is incredibly important. So thank you, Kristen. And thank you everyone here for coming this afternoon. That concludes this afternoon's presentation. As Kristen's reminded us all, her works, her published works are available in the shop. On your way out, please have a look. And remember, if you like the author, buy the book.
Thank you for coming.